The bitter struggle between Arab and Jew for control of the Holy Land has caused untold suffering in the Middle East for generations. It is often claimed that the crisis originated with Jewish immigration to Palestine and the foundation of the State of Israel. Yet the roots of the conflict are to be found much earlier in British double-dealing during the First World War. This is a story of intrigue among rival empires, of misguided strategies, and of how conflicting promises to Arab and Jew created a legacy of bloodshed, which has determined the fate of the Middle East. Music. During the First World War, the British, the French, and the Russians had these secret plans to carve up the Ottoman Empire because they believed that would balance out their imperial ambitions. But tough luck for the Turks, the Arabs, and anyone else who got in the way. Certainly all the seeds were planted then, in the sense that it was the British who promised the Arabs independence on the one hand, and a Jewish homeland on the other, and you could not simply reconcile one with the other. The British scattered promises to anyone who might be of some use to them without thinking about the consequences. So British duplicity, British double-dealing went a long way to perpetuate the conflict in Palestine. At the end of the day, when you're fighting a war, you are very liberal in what you're offering in terms of a post-war settlement. When you get down to the conference table, when the war has ended, and you have to start honoring your agreements, you then have to decide what's in your interest or not. But you saw the Middle East as a Western flank for that power in India, and that power in general, the story of Britain's involvement in the Middle East and the ensuing struggle between Arab and Jew begins with her colonial past at the beginning of the 20th century. King Edward V ruled over a vast empire with interests in every part of the world. India became increasingly important because, it was the second pillar of British power in the world. Moving the Indian Army about was extremely important in extending British interests and British influence across the globe, and the SE Canal was, of course, the quick way to do that. It's very 304 important for the British geopolitical position to ensure the SE Canal remains safe and secure. With this aim in mind, Britain had become the only European power to establish a major foothold in the Middle East, in the principalities around the Persian Gulf, in Aden and in Egypt. Britain had annexed Egypt from Turkey's Ottoman Empire in 1882, and by the time it was made a protectorate in 1914, Cairo had become the center of British power in the Middle East. The presence of imperial troops in the region was of vital strategic importance for the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Muhammad II. I was in alliance with Britain's much-feared rival, Germany, together with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These countries made up the Central Powers, and pitted against them were the three allies, Britain, France, and Russia. Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries from History Hit and uncover the secrets of some of the most famous people and events in history. History Hit brings you the stories that shaped the world through exclusive documentaries from the world's top historians. Travel with us to the bloody Battle of Stalingrad or uncover the lives of the people who called Pompeii home. We also aim to bring you the stories and legends that shaped our world through our award-winning podcast. Network. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% of their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at the First World War checkout. From the Ottoman capital Constantinople in Turkey, the Sultan ruled over the last of the great Islamic empires. It had been an almost terminal decline for decades, yet the fate of the Ottoman Empire was to be sealed by the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 in Europe. Germany's rapid advance was halted by Britain and France along the Western Front in the East Russia's war against Germany and Austria. Hungary, so reached deadlock, the powerful weapons of the industrial age were killing thousands of men in the trenches of every army. All of the leading powers expected the war to be over within a matter of months. So, in that sense, all of them are surprised at the end of 1914, when not merely is the war going on, but it shows every sign of being likely to go on for a very long time. At that point, they began to think about new ways of winning the war. Britain's Prime Minister Asquith felt that with the stalemate in Europe, it was essential to widen the conflict together with Foreign Secretary, Lord Grey, Minister for War, Lord Kitchener, and the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. They masterminded a complex strategy to undermine the Central Powers. This was a global war, and the British saw the Middle East very much in a global context. The traditional British preference for Sid shows as people, unfavorably call it the indirect strategy, the way of attacking the soft underbelly as church. Will called it of the enemy. And the soft underbelly was seen to be Turkey, Britain's secret plan, involved on the one hand, a military diversion, and on the other, a devious use of diplomacy through bribery, subversion, and double-dealing. All these devices focused on the enemy's weakest link. Turkey's Ottoman Empire diplomacy in general has always had a secret dimension to it. Where discretion ends and conspiracy begins is an open question. But during the period up to and during the First World War, there was a particularly intense set of negotiations and discussions between the major imperial powers, between the French, the Russians, and the British in particular, cut in the Italians as well, about what would they do when the war was over and when the Ottoman Empire broke up. The British government hoped that, by striking a deal over the spoils of war, it would strengthen the alliance against the Central Music powers amongst the Allies. Russia had long sought access to the Mediterranean in a secret treaty of March 1915. Britain and France offered what was to the Tsar a prize of vital geopolitical importance. Constantinople, it is that outlet into the wider world and into the Mediterranean, and it is the one thing, of course, the British and the French have been attempting to prevent the Russians from achieving. So this is a complete volte-face. This is the British, the French, and the Russians coming to an agreement over something which was up to this point almost inconceivable. Italy's King Victoria Emmanuel was another target for bribery. Britain, France, and Russia tried to tempt Italy, a pro-German state, to join the Allies. In April 1915, a secret treaty offered Italy a substantial bit of Ottoman real estate in Anatolia. Again, it's another power coming into the equation and being offered territorial advancement, which in normal circumstances would have been quite inconceivable. The bribe worked. Italy joined the Allies and declared war on the Central Powers in August, the Arab nationalism movement, 1915. But Britain's strategy to undermine the enemy via the Ottoman Empire also required subversion by using domestic opposition to weaken, maybe even destroy it. Britain exploited a new movement sweeping through the empire, nationalism, in the sense of believing that there are peoples with a clear cultural identity and that these people should have independent. That idea spread to the Middle East as to other parts of the world in the latter part of the 19th century. So, you had the beginnings in the Ottoman Empire of a Turkish nationalism. This came to a head when the Young Turks took power in a coup in 1908 and started to impose their language and culture on the Arabs of the empire. But this only reawakened an interest amongst Arabs in their own heritage. 1,000 years before, Arabs had brought the technology and literature of the East to the West and their religion. Islam had encompassed much of Asia, North Africa, and southwestern Europe. The idea of recovering that historic grandeur had remained in the consciousness of Arab intellectuals. By the start of the First World War, the antagonism between Arab and Turk had increased. The very fact that the Turks were saying, "We want to have a unified empire," meant the Arabs said, "Wait a minute, we're not part of this." So all of this literary and nationalistic revival then took a much more political form, and therefore you got the emergence of Arab. Sykes-Picot Agreement ignore French ambitions, and that French were determined to have their historical piece of the Lant Pour over a map of the Levant. Sykes and Picot personally drew in the areas they wished to see under their control. Their secret deal amounted to the virtual carve-up of the Middle East in Area A for the French and Area B for the British. The imperialists intended to exercise power indirectly, They would appoint advisors and take charge of the finances in their respective spheres of influence. Then there was the area colored blue, which was to be directly controlled by France. This included what was then known as Greater Syria, where the French traditionally had commercial and religious interests. As for the area colored pink, known as Iraq, with its strategic ports, railways, and oil. This was to be under British rule. The area colored yellow represented Palestine and was envisaged as an international zone, except for high air. What the British wanted was the oil of Iraq, and they concentrated on getting Iraq and getting away from Iraq to the Mediterranean in order to transport this oil. So they got Ha on the Palestinian coast, and they got most of Iraq. The Suez-Picot Agreement was a pretty shameful document, and I wouldn't attempt to defend it, but it was drawn up by people who were sort of operating under the old kind of balance of power considerations in an imperial frame of mind, unaware of these secret dealings behind their backs. Hassan and Faisal proclaimed independence, and in June 1916 attacked the Turkish troops. The Arab revolt against the Ottomans had begun. The Turkish garrison at Mecca was soon overrun, and the seaport at Jeddah seized by 1917. Hussein and Phil's forces had pushed north and engaged the Ottoman Turks along the Hejaz Railway. The British saw the Arab revolt as part of its strategy for creating a military diversion against the Central Powers. In a pincer movement, Britain had launched a campaign from the southwest to ensure control of the Suez Canal and the Levant, and from the southeast it was fighting to secure the oil wells of Iraq, all this to attack the Central Powers at their weakest point. The Ottoman Empire, the Arabs hitched their fortunes to the British. They considered themselves to be fighting with the Allies, but at the same time they were not merged into the British Army, that they continued to act as an independent army called the Northern Army, while the Arab Army advanced northwards. Britain's General Allenby had crossed the Suez Canal, and by the spring of 1917 his forces had reached the frontier of Palestine. The war in Europe, however, was still not going well for Britain. The attempted push through the German lines at the Somme had produced little territorial gain, and the cost in lives was colossal. In Laon, there had been a change of leadership. The new Prime Minister Lloyd George felt that the Allied war effort needed a fresh impetus. Although America had so far been neutral in the war, Lloyd George was convinced that could be changed. He believed there was one powerful group which might influence the American government. Lloyd George thought that the political power of international Jews, American decision, whether to join or not, would defend critically on public opinion, and the Jewish support could tilt the scales in one direction or the other. You've got to remember that the British Foreign Office greatly overestimate the political power of international Jewry, particularly the wealthy, financial, and commercial Jewish elites. What is extraordinary about this situation is that here you have, particularly the British, seeing the Jewish world as one collective monolithic entity, and in that sense they start looking at the role of the Jews in the war as being something which might be important. And from the point of view of the Allies, something else quite remarkable: this monolithic collective entity is pro-German, many Jews in the upper echelons. The origins of Zionist movement of German society did indeed have close connections to the Kaiser's Foreign Office, a new Jewish nationalist movement. Zionism had also been able to establish its headquarters in Berlin. Zionism had originated in the 1880s after Theodor Herzl published a book espousing the virtues of a Jewish state. This caused a sensation amongst Jewish intellectuals in Germany, Austria, and Russia, who shared Herzl's outrage at the escalation of anti-Jewish Americans in. There's no way that the British and the French on their own are ever going to defeat Germany. In October, the British government received an intelligence report suggesting that Jews were significant influence in the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, the new revolutionary movement emerging as the dominant force in Russia. Lloyd George feared that these communists would take Russia out of the war, With the Americans still refusing to commit sufficient forces, he knew it was time to act. He instructed his Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to issue a pledge to Balfour Declaration. Capture the hearts and minds of the Jewish people, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievements of this object. The Balfour Declaration was issued on November 2, 1917, just as British forces were occupying Palestine. I would say that the Balfour Declaration has to be understood not as an idealistic gesture, but it has to be understood within the framework of British imperial policy. And Lloyd George was the main instigator of that declaration, because he believed that it would serve Britain's interests. But this was also the first time that any major European power had given official backing for the Zionist goal of making Palestine into a Jewish homeland. Yet Sharif Hussein had understood that Palestine had been promised as part of his deal for Arab independence, anticipating Arab outrage at the prospect of a Jewish homeland in a largely Arab province. The Balfour Declaration had also stated that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The declaration nonetheless appeared to indicate British support for Jewish immigration. There were only a mere 80,000 out of some 700,000 people. Jews in Palestine who were Jews. The indigenous inhabitants of Palestine were referred to as non-Jewish inhabitants, and that Palestine was being identified even at that stage as a Jewish land. And all the others had no defined identity. They were simply non-Jewish. The Balfour Declaration was what it says, a declaration. It wasn't a treaty, it wasn't a signed agreement, it was a declaration in support of the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In fact, the only treaty Britain had signed in regard to Palestine was with the French, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement on November 7th. Within a few days of the Balfour Declaration, the Bolsheviks took power in Russia. Lee George hoped that it would have the desired effect of appeasing the Jews in the communist leadership. What is it that they supposedly so want as Jews, Palestine? Now, the whole argument is totally illogical. It's a nonsense argument because these particular people, if one were to think of people like Trotsky or Zinoviev or Yaf, some of the key Jewish leaders in the Russian Revolution, the November Revolution, these people, of course, are internationalists. There were 15 to 20 Jews in the higher echelons of the Bolshevik Party. Most of them were anti-Zionists, and after they came to power, soon after they came to power, they issued a declaration to say that Zionism is a capitalist ploy, a capitalist, the secret treaties idea, the wildly inaccurate intelligence report on which Lloyd George based his strategy was to have major implications for Britain within weeks. Russia's new leaders did exactly the opposite of what he had expected. Not only did they pull out of the war, they opened up the archives of the Tsar's Foreign Office and published the secret treaties. The very treaties Britain had engineered with her allies to carve up the Ottoman Empire, and to which Russia had been privy. That, of course, is a very great embarrassment to the Western allies, because the Allies have been doing all sorts of deals behind the scenes in which they have handed out to each other large sections of the world, meanwhile openly preaching that they are fighting the war in defense of democracy, and of course also telling, among others, the Arabs that they are supporters of self-determination for the peoples of the Ottoman Empire. Publication of the secret treaties by the Bolek certainly created an enormous suspicion in the Arab world, and this meant that the Sharif Hussein and the others said, "Wait a minute, what's going on? Why are you not giving us independence? And secondly, why are you dividing us up into Zone A and Zone B?" And at that point, of course, the Arabs realized that not only had the British got their own particular interests, for example, in the ports of Palestine or in Iraq, but that they had promised other things to the Arab confusion and suspicion. French aid, Arab confusion and suspicion. General Eleni entered Jerusalem on foot, together with Sykes-Picot and a number of other Allied notables. His British forces had captured the Holy City in December 1917. The leaders of the Arab revolt, however, were nowhere to be seen. Fearing that Hussein and Faisal might lose heart, the British government forwarded a message to them reiterating British commitment to Arab independence. The Arab race shall be given full opportunity of once again forming a nation in the world. This can only be achieved by the Arabs themselves, uniting, and Great Britain and her allies will pursue a policy with this ultimate unity in view. Hussein stayed loyal to the Allied cause, still prepared to accept Britain's word on Arab independence, although he spoke of settling accounts after the war. From Alam's point of view, he continued to rely on Arab support in the war against the Ottomans, but now that Jerusalem had been occupied by the British, one party seized the Arab Revolt Initiative in April 1918. Chaim Wittmann and the International Zionist Commissioner traveled to Palestine to lay the foundation for a Hebrew university. Their hope was that it would become the intellectual hub of Zionism. Weidmann's visit, however, caused widespread alarm and indignation among the Arab population. And when he and the chief rabbi of Jerusalem met General Allenby, it looked as if Britain was preparing to honor the Balfour Declaration 6 months later. Alam's forces entered Damascus with their Ali Phil's Northern Army. They had pushed the Ottoman troops north through Palestine into Syria. The Arab revolt did contribute to the victory of the Allies. First of all, it protected the British flank in Palestine. Second, it kept a number of Turkish and German troops preoccupied. And third, the British could have never legitimized what they were doing unless they had the blessing of a particular Arab force. On the 3rd of October, the people of Damascus flocked to Phil's victory parade. If he was to seize power, he knew it was of great importance to make his presence felt and to be seen by the Arab people as their liberator. The fall of Damascus later the same day. However, Faisal met with General Allenby at the Victoria Hotel in Damascus. Allenby warned him that his rule in Syria would be limited. The British by that time knew that they were going to hand over Syria to the French, so they couldn't actually accept Fayad as a legitimate ruler. All they could do is to pay him his salary and the expenses of his army and his administration. Undaunted by Alan's warnings, Faisal assumed the title of governor of Damascus with the support of his father, Sheriff Hussein. He set about creating a power base for their goal of an independent Arab state. On the 31st of October, the Ottomans were finally defeated, and at 11 alls on the 11th of November 1918, the guns fell silent in Europe as the war with the Central Powers came to an end. The peace conference at Versailles. Peace conference began in January 1919. Representatives of the victorious Allies, such as the French Prime Minister Cléo and the American President Woodrow Wilson, gathered to sort out what was to be done with the former territories of the defeated empires. Now, the liberal use of promises by the British government had to be prioritized. They did indeed make pledges to the Arabs, but they also made pledges to the Jews, and they also made pledges to the French and the Russians and everybody else. And these people saw the world as an imperial world. Not only did they want to carve out the Middle East, they wanted to carve up Russia. They thought this was the last great moment in which the imperial powers would be able to sit down and grab what was going, particularly since there was no one to stop them. But Britain and her old ally France were up against the American President Woodrow Wilson's vision of a new world order which promoted national self-determination. Nation once independence had seemed to be a possibility. That this principle of self-determination, supported by the Americans, was going to be offered to all those who were to be liberated from former empires like the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. What the Palestinians wanted was an independent state. In fact, Faisal had come from Damascus to plead the Arab 3958 cause, but the future of Palestine in the Middle East formed part of Britain's pledge to France in the Sykes-Picot Car 4010, up in the event Woodrow Wilson's principles about self-determination were 40-15 forgotten when it came to the people of the Middle East. Britain and France were free to go ahead with their 40-25 agreement. But what of the promises Britain had made to the Jews regarding 4031? Palestine Foreign Secretary Arthur Baylor, in a confidential memo during the Versa 4037, peace talks with America, France, and Italy, wrote the four great powers are 4042, committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in 40-48 Agong traditions, in present leads, in future hopes of far profounder import. 40-53, then the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land that might sound like a warm endorsement of Zionism, yet further in the post-war memorandum, Baylor hints at a much more cynical agenda. So far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no declaration of policy, which at least in letter they have not always intended to violate. The Versailles Peace Conference was concluded on June the 28th, 1919, with the creation of the League of Nations, the first global institution for peace and security. Its covenant provided that the Arab and other territories ceded by the defeated Ottoman Empire should be administered by mandates, which meant in effect that Britain and France were given the authority to impose their rule over the Arab territories on November the 21st, 1919. François-Georges Picot, the co-architect of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the French General Gouraud arrived in Butte, and so began the imposition of the French mandate for Syria and Applause Lebanon. The British forces who had occupied the region since ousting the Ottoman Turks during the last months of the war were handing over power to the French, thus fulfilling their wartime pledge. Faisal, who had been the governor of Damascus now for 16 months, had been consolidating his position when he was proclaimed king by the Syrian National Congress. The French were incensed, and General Gouraud sent in his troops by August the 7th, 1920. Faisal had been deposed and had to flee to Palestine. The promises to Sharif Hussein and Faisal of a single independent state were now a distant memory for the Europeans. The whole issue of spheres of the seeds of partition influence meant that what was, at first, appeared to be willingness to accept a single Arab state was in fact seriously diluted. And then on top of that, of course, the very fact of there being a French area and a British area meant that in effect this was the seed of partition. So you had both independence was denied, but also the unity of this area was denied. The boundaries and governments of the Middle Eastern states that emerged bore the unmistakable imprint of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The French half of the previously Ottoman province of Great Assyria became the mandate for Lebanon and Syria. The other half became the British mandate for Transjordan and Palestine in the east, the Ottoman area of Mesopotamia, which included the oil fields of Moul, was given to Britain as the mandate for Iraq. So this was basically the importance of the Sapo Agreement to divide what is called the Fertile Crescent between Iraq and Syria, and let Britain get access to the oil of the area and be able to exploit it in the future. But British rule was initially rejected by the Iraqi people until Faisal was installed as king in July 1921. Britain hoped the limited pate devolved to him would serve to bait the frustrated demands for Arab independence. But Sharif Hussein expected more from the British. He never gave up the idea that the British had promised him independence not only in Arabia, but in Syria and Iraq as well. And he wanted the British to fulfill their promises. Sharif Hussein's dream of an Arab kingdom ruled by the Hashemites was only partially fulfilled, for although his other son Abdullah became king of Transjordan, their old rival Ibn Saud swept the Hashites out of Hijaz. When he conquered the whole of the Arabian Peninsula in Jerusalem, an administration was established by the British in the spring of 1920. There were no plans for devolving power in Palestine. Palestine was a land sacred to three religions. Jews were a small minority who had lived harmoniously with Christians and the much larger community of Muslims for hundreds of music years. But the Balfour Declaration promising Jews a homeland in Palestine had been incorporated into the British Mandate at Versailles. Palestine was thus to be open for new European Jewish immigration. The Balfour Declaration, with celebrations and parades in support of Zionist activities, it seemed as if the British were going to honor their pledges to the Jews and ignore Palestinian hopes of independence. The Arabs had a strong case, but very poor advocates. The Zionists had a case. It wasn't as strong as that of the local Arabs, but they had brilliant advocates. Zionism is one of the greatest public relations success stories of the 20th century, and K. Vittman exemplified these traditional Jewish skills of advocacy and persuasion. Some of these skills were clearly in evidence when Vittman and various Zionist groups helped finance land purchases and the building of settlements for immigrant Jews. At the same time, political and security organizations were created to support the emerging Jewish homeland. The Arab community in Palestine was incensed. The Palestinians couldn't conceive their country being divided or given away to another community H, which had nothing to do with the Middle East in the first place and was almost wholly European at the time. So to them it seemed absurd that 600 to 700,000 should give up their land, their homes, their villages, their towns, and hand them over to a minority which was dispersed throughout Palestine. And Palestine, after all, is named after its people, who are the Palestinians. In 1925, Arthur Balfour toured the new Jewish settlements in Palestine, although he was feted as a hero of the Zionist cause. The immigration of European Jews was to have unforeseen consequences for British rule in Palestine. I believe that the Balfour Declaration was one of the most serious mistakes in British imperial history. It committed Britain to support of Jewish nationalism in Palestine after the war, and it did not produce any immediate benefits for Britain without the Balfour Declaration. There could have been no genuine development of a Jewish national home. And the follow-through in 1948, where you get the creation of a state of Israel, simply would not have happened. It requires the umbrella of the British to be there in effect to support the emerging Jewish national home militarily at the bottom line. The very fact that there are British troops, British policemen there to protect the Jewish communities is ultimately central to the situation. It could not have been done in any other way throughout the 1930s and 40s. The years of Nazi persecution and the Holocaust, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased rapidly. But what was seen by the Arabs as an alien incursion and the Jews as a fulfillment of historic rights led to polarization and violence in response to terrorist acts by Arabs. Britain restricted the immigration, but the policy only stimulated Jewish terrorism. Against this background, Britain relinquished its mandate, and the State of Israel was born in 1948, when the first of several wars between the new state and its Arab neighbors began. Thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled their homeland. Thus, the strategies employed by Britain to win the First World War inadvertently left a deep divide between Arab and Jew. The most serious consequences of British policy during the war was the encouragement of Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism, and in the aftermath of the First World War was left with this legacy of double-dealing and of betrayal, which was to haunt her for a long, long time. Clearly, it played a role in dividing the Arab world into different states, in allowing the establishment of the State of Israel, and in frustrating Arab desires. But if what happened in Sayas-Pico and everything else that happened in the First World War is used as an excuse for the problems of the Middle East, now I think that would be a mistake. But yes, the roots of what we see today certainly arose from the double-dealing of the First World War and from the frustrated expectations of that.